Welcome to episode 227 of Silver Lining for Learning. Can you believe this is the 5-year mark? Actually, 5 years and one day, but who's counting? We started this show on March 21st of 2020, and as many of you know, I went running before the first show and ran for 4 straight years, and then I had a little operation. Then I started running about 17 days later, so I'm getting close to running 5 years in a row, skipping 17 days or so. It's been a pleasure to be with my co-host, Chris Dede from Harvard, Lydia Kao from the University of Toronto. We have Punya Mishra from Arizona State University, who's not with us today. He may pop in. He's at the SITE conference in Orlando and also visiting his daughter. And Yang Zhao from the University of Kansas, who's traveling through parts of China typically, so he probably will not be here either. We have Lin, who's from SMU, Southern Methodist University, where she is a professor of teaching and learning at the Simmons School of Education and Human Development. She also has a new role for the National Science Foundation, in which we'll probably chat about for a bit today. She is a program officer or director on an Intergovernmental Personal Act APA assignment. So we'll hear all about what that is. Her degree is from Columbia University, which has been in the news lately. We won't get into that in this show since we're apolitical for the most part. She's been a good friend of mine for a long, long time, dealing in the areas of STEM, AI, online learning, gaming, all sorts of things, innovative technologies in general. Also with us today is David Wiley, who was at BYU, who was at Utah State, who's now with Lumen Learning as the Chief Academic Officer, and he is one of the founders of the open education movement. We wouldn't have made as much progress in the area of open education if it wasn't for David. And David was a very important cog in the wheel for me when I wrote The World is Open book. I contacted him many times, and he had sources and people and resources that he sent to me. And probably some of those people's sources and resources will come up during this show. In fact, I think we could use a little history lesson in all of that, David, and maybe we start off with that. That'd be a good topic because we've had many shows in the past on open education, on MOOCs, massive open online courses, of which you were the instigator. You taught the first proto-MOOC, I think, when you gave certificates to anybody who showed up. You didn't kind of tell your president that was going to happen until a little later after the announcement, but that's okay. If anyone wants to read something really interesting, I mean really interesting, just David's blog. Read anything David wrote, anything Lin wrote, because they have pushed the field ahead. And that's why we brought them in today, because we're going to talk a little bit about the past, a bunch about the present, and maybe project into the future as this being the 5-year anniversary show of Silver Lining for Learning. Now, one more thing before we go to David with that opening question. This stack is just the shows I've worked on for this year, okay? I cleaned the stack last summer, okay? So there, and Chris has his stack, and Punya has his stack, and Young is. We've been fortunate to have on this show people from around the world, from Chile, Brazil, South Africa, Italy, UK, China, Malaysia, Myanmar, Indonesia. I could keep going and going on and on. Singapore, Korea, if I didn't say that before, and Japan. We're really lucky to have friends, colleagues, associates, acquaintances all around the world that can participate in this show. If you are listening to this show now, if you are watching this show now, and you would like to appear on this show, send us a note. We would love to have you on in the future. Tell us what you're working on and why we might consider having you on the show. I think that's a long enough intro to let David's mind wander a bit back into the day of 2001 when OER, or Open Courseware, was announced by Charles Vest at MIT. It was April 4th, 2001 or something like that, and
Yeah.
then we
No, I
had
don't know the date,
2008,
just the year.
yeah, but 2001. Yeah. So anyways, David, tell us a little bit about that and, your influence on the field, plus the Open Courseware shell that you built, I think, and others utilize, right? So people might need a little history lesson. They're reading about the impact of open books, which you've been a key influencer in, open textbook project. Today, in fact, you're still helping community colleges here in Indiana, right here in Bloomington, Ivy Tech, save a lot of money at Lumen Learning and other places. So David, I've talked and babbled a bit. Tell us a little bit about open education and MOOCs.
Well, is starting with history really? Do we want people to go to sleep right at the beginning of the podcast? I don't know.
I love
Um,
history.
Let me see. Let me tell you one story, and I'll take a minute to share kind of my origin story with all of this, and then I'll kind of skip through the rest of it much more quickly. But in 1998, I was the webmaster at Marshall University. And I was sitting in my office one day and I was developing a calculator in JavaScript that was going on to the university website. And it was nothing, super technologically sophisticated. It was a JavaScript calculator. But as I was working on it, I had this kind of epiphany in which I understood that that calculator was very, very different from the physical calculators that I had known in my life up to that point. And this is like nothing that I discovered, like economists had known about these qualities of goods for a very long time. But I kind of had this realization that the with a physical calculator, like say in my class at Davis Creek Elementary School here in West Virginia, we might have had a certain number of physical calculators, and you might wait your turn for somebody else to finish and hand you one so you could take a turn working the calculator. But when you digitized a calculator and put it on a web page, everybody in the world could use that same calculator all at the same time. And this idea that instead of needing the budget to pay for 20 calculators or 50 calculators or 100, we could just build one and put it online. And once it was digital, people didn't have to compete for access to it. They could all access it simultaneously. Um, that just really, it was like the clouds parted and a ray of light came down. And it felt like a revelation almost. And this seemed very, very important. So this was late in 97. Early in 98, um, two words were said that had never been said together before. It was open source software. In February of 98, a group of people got together who were um, big fans of the free software development approach, but not fans of the free software label or philosophy. Um, and they said, let's call this open source and put a little different underpinning underneath it, different motivation for why you might engage with open source. And that was also very inspiring to me. So in the summer of 98, I started writing letters to leaders in the open source software movement and the free software movement and saying, what if we did this for things that weren't software? What if we did it for textbooks or for journal articles or for photographs or for essays or for fiction or like anything else in the world that's not software? And got back very positive responses, both from Richard Stallman, from Eric Raymond, from others I reached out to. And so that summer started the Open Content Project, where I released the first open source license for something that wasn't software, an open source license for just any kind of content, and started advocating for this idea that we ought to be sharing open content with each other in the same kind of spirit of open source software. So anybody can make copies, you can change it and edit it to make it do whatever it is that you need it to do. And that was the beginning of it for me. That's how I got into it. So that was summer of 98. Over the next several years, there was some interest. I don't know, by 2000, there were a couple of 100,000 pages that you could find via Alta Vista back in the day, kind of if you weren't using Google yet, that were using the open content license to share material out in the open. Technical documentation, it was very popular for technical documentation, but some technical books and other books as well. My book, The Instructional Use of Learning Objects, which was published in 2000 by AECT, I think is probably the first open textbook because it had used that open license, the open publication license. And then starting in 2001, you have the announcement of MIT OpenCourseWare, and later in 2001, the formation of Creative Commons. And those two things really start to kick things off in the public imagination. Before then, open content had been limited to some nerds like me. And then when Chuck Vest started talking about it, everybody got excited about it. Um, I don't know that. I mean, that's my history with it, and that's how it started for me. At Utah State, I had a research center called the Center for Open and Sustainable Learning that I ran there for several years that created a courseware kind of enablement platform called EduCommons that I think you were referring to, Kurt. So in the late 2000s, somewhere between a third and a half of all the university open courseware projects around the world were running on this open source software that we created to enable those open courseware projects. And then, skip ahead a few years. And of course, I'm just telling my part of the story. I'm not telling I mean, I talked about Creative Commons and MIT, but obviously I'm not hitting every major event that happened along the way. But at the end of 2012, beginning of 2013 is when my partner Kim Thanos and I started Lumen Learning, the original conception of which was to be like a Red Hat for OER. So if you're familiar with Red Hat, the company, they take open source software, but then they provide support and training and other kind of value added services around that to make it easier for people to be able to feel confident adopting open source software. And that's how Lumen started, was how could we help faculty feel more confident adopting OER, knowing that it's going to be updated, knowing that it's always going to be there, the uptime guarantees and things like that for availability. And that was 12 years ago now. So anyway, there are some of the high points. I don't know if there's something else you wanted me to mention, but that's a little bit of history from my perspective and my involvement along the way.
I'm muted. Okay, yeah, I do, David. Just quickly, and we'll go to Lynn and get her origin story. I know at some point in China, she was trying to become a linguist or something like that. How she ended up in the field, you might want to talk about. Maybe it wasn't being a linguist, but it's close. David, right now I'm teaching two classes, the same course number, but one online, one face-to-face, and I have a couple dozen students who are international, and about half of those are here in Bloomington, half are around the world. And I'm going to give them certificates at the end. Everybody, whoever shows up, shows up. You want to tell the
Yes.
story? You are on the front page of the Chronicle, I think. And I think
Yes.
probably the president of your university read the front page of the Chronicle that week and was like, "Oh, what's he doing?" So you want to tell us what
Yeah, I'll
year
tell
that
that
was?
story too.
2008 or something?
2007.
Seven?
So, I've always been experimenting with my courses, and I still teach as an adjunct now, trying to figure out how I can be more open. And so I started, in the early 2000s, I started doing things like putting the course syllabus in a wiki and inviting students to make edits to the syllabus, to change assignments, to just to try to get them to engage somehow. Selecting readings that were openly licensed or at least openly available, pulling the course out of the LMS so that it wasn't hidden behind a password. But I ran the courses, I basically stand up new blogs and run the courses via the blogs. And at one point in the fall of 2007, I taught for the first time my Intro to Open Ed course. And I thought, you know what? All of the course content is accessible via the blog. A bunch of the homework is going to be done via the wiki. What's not done via the wiki is going to be done by students posting on their own blogs. I'd completely extricated myself from the LMS at that point, and I realized if somebody wanted to play the home version of this game, with us as we were doing the course, they could do that. And the more I thought about it, the more interesting I thought that would be. And so over the summer in 2007, I kind of put out the call. I'm teaching this Intro to Open Ed course. It's going to be open. I'm going to run it in this way. If you'd like to participate, here's a page on the wiki. Come let me know. Put in your name, your email address, and the link to your blog. And then we had a blog aggregator that was pulling together everything that people were writing so that you could read everything happening in the course in one spot. And I said, you cannot earn Utah State University credit for this course if you're not here and registered and paying tuition. But if you complete all the assignments, I'll give you a certificate that says David Wiley says that I completed his Intro to Open Ed course. And won't say the university name anywhere because it's not, if you're in the Netherlands taking this course, it's just something we're all doing together online. You're not affiliated with the university at that point. So we had 70 some people. I think there were 8 from USU and then another 60 some from around the world who participated in that course. And I did give out certificates at the end of it. And I did have a conversation with university administration after the Chronicle story broke to make sure that I hadn't, misrepresented things or told people that now they have Utah State credits or something else. I assured them, no, I showed them the certificate. No, it doesn't say the university name anywhere. It just says I took this online class with David Wiley, and he says I finished. Um, and then in 2008, in the spring of 2008, George Siemens and Stephen Downs taught a course in using a similar kind of setup and put out a public invitation. And they had much larger enrollments in that course. I want to say they had 2,000 people or so in that course. And when people think about the history of MOOCs, they typically point to the Downs and Siemens course as the first one that was truly massive in the sense that it had, 2,000 students. But I do like to think that I had, I played a little inspirational kind of role in that as it rolled out.
Yeah, I've read the history of MOOCs, and some people call it, you did the proto MOOC, as they call it.
Proto MOOC. Okay.
Proto MOOC. So, that was 2007. He also helped create Degreed and many other, Mountain Heights Academy. The virtual schools in Utah were first started through David's work. That led to your 2009 recognition from Fast Company as one of the most 100 creative people in business world. So you're the only academic on that list, which is also kind of interesting anyhow.
Strange, yeah.
Yeah, but you've made many lists. So we'll go over to Lynn and chat with her for a few minutes, and then open it up for everyone to have a conversation with both of you. And Lynn, have you thought a little bit about your origin story and how you ended up where you are today at Southern Methodist University and NSF? And we'll talk about NSF later on in the show.
Well, since you mentioned NSF, I think I'm going to put a disclaimer first because of the policies and standards at NSF. So basically, all that I'm saying here are my own and do not necessarily represent NSF's positions, strategies, or opinions. So I put that out there. But and then, so David, what you said really, it just brought back all the memories. I had somewhat similar parallel experiences, somehow also diverted to different interests, I guess. I remember in early 2000, 2001, I was at Teachers College, Columbia University. We were actually also, at the time, MIT OpenCourseWare was so popular and everyone wanted to imitate doing something similar. I was in New York City, so there was NYU Online. And Columbia also had I think it's called Phantom, in collaboration with 10 to 15 universities across the globe. And I was a student, so we were asked to create a lot of those courses, online courses, open courses. And then at the time, it was just so exciting, fascinating. And we created a lot of NPR style or, very high quality courses. So the process was more like, there are publications by, for example, Chomsky, and then we would put the article and then make all the hyperlinks, and we would invite Chomsky to give a talk, and then the talk would have annotates, links to different resources as well. So we created a lot of materials open, and then they somehow, after a few years, they somehow all disappeared. All this, I don't know where they are. At least I cannot find them anymore. So one of the reasons, as I was told, Chris probably was familiar with this. I remember when I first became a faculty member and your name, Chris, everyone talked about your work there. So I think one of the reasons was there's no profit. So all the universities, they put a lot of resources in creating the high quality materials, but then they couldn't use them to create, at least at that time, right? They couldn't turn them into certificates or degrees, and they were public knowledge, high quality knowledge, yet there's only giving, no receiving, I guess, from the university's perspective. So sort of, that whole open thing, for me, it paused. But at the same time, I was wondering what I could do. I was very interested, also started with the internet. And then because we were creating all these hyperlinks, and then I started to be very interested into the distractions, the concept of distractions. People would start somewhere. We would always joke, like they started to learn something and then they ended up buying a pair of shoes, right? So all these distractions, and then so that led me to my interest in distractions, media multitasking, the relationship between multimedia design and media multitasking. And then that also led to this human computer interaction and the human capacity for teaching and learning. And then that's, of course, led to my current interest in artificial intelligence. And again, it's about the interactions between humans and computers and new technologies. And along the line, actually, Chris, your name always came up. So I wanted to maybe, if Chris, maybe you wanted to say a few words about that history too, since you were right there, your name was right there. We at least in my, when I was a doctoral student, we were asked to read a lot of your work.
Well, thank you. I want to make sure that you have enough time to talk more about your work. So I'll just interject quickly and say that at elite universities particularly, people worry about brand. This is a big deal at Harvard. Harvard has an entire floor of lawyers who do nothing but try to protect the Harvard brand and bring down the gates of hell on anybody that dares to transgress. And so there's this fundamental contradiction at the heart, which is that brand depends on scarcity, but impact depends on scale. And the elite universities always end up protecting the brand, but then having much less impact. It's ironic and sad, really. MIT was the one exception to that in the U.S., and they have not diminished their brand. But it shows that if you turn running the universities over to lawyers, you're never going to do anything innovative at all.
Lynn, do you want to talk more about your current interests, or?
I think I can pause there. I just, what David said really made me think a lot about that history that I went through as well. It's really interesting that David and Kurt, both of you have been doing so much looking at, a much broader picture, while we kind of were in that environment, very exciting environment. Somehow, I shifted more towards like more individual on an individual level. So I thought it was very interesting that way.
We're going to go over to Lydia next, but I'm going to interject one comment here of people that our listeners might want to look up. David mentioned Richard Stallman at MIT. He's in the book Machines of Loving Grace. He's featured in it. I recommend you buy that book or rent that book out because it has his 200-year history of computing technology in the world. It's a fascinating book. And he also mentioned Eric Raymond, the open source guy. Both Richard Stallman and Eric Raymond are open source people. When I was working on a couple open source papers, that we published in IRODL. And then a third one got published about the same time. We tried to interview Eric Stallman, and we had a paper trying to link the social constructivist movement to the open ed movement. And as a computer scientist, he just said, that's excrement. He wanted nothing to do with us. And so, but Richard Stallman, on the other hand, was very engaging and is a very interesting person to hear the history of computing technology in the US and around the world. Chris mentioned there's lots going on at Harvard all the time. And I just remember back in the day, there was not Harvard. That was popular, that your attorneys were trying to shut down, and many other entities that were popping up. I remember the Evil House of Cheat and Pink Monkey, places you could cheat online. People were worried about plagiarism and cheating. Well, let's come back again with AI anyhow. But I think Lydia has a question. She's going to jump in here now. Lydia.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to hear the origin story of open source and MOOC, and then Lillian, your experience of working in the open educational resource space. I'm just wondering, and I wonder our listener must be thinking about this, like, where is open educational resource now as current state, and where do you think it is going?
Len, do you want to go first?
Oh, that's outstanding question. You're looking at what's going on now. I sometimes wonder whether we are more closed or we are, at least currently, right, between all these different conflicts and different shifts of priorities and boundaries. So it's really interesting to know about where are the open resources. So I think the problem is, I guess, two ends. One is the shifts of priorities, policies. Another is the so much information, right? So the amount of information also makes the open source almost very difficult, right? We don't know the quality of the information or even the reality, the truth of the information. So being open, and to what extent, I think going back to David's point, we wanted everyone to have education, everyone to have access to resources. But then now with so much, it's almost like we're lost in the amount of information.
David, you want to jump in here?
It didn't take long to go from there not being any OER at all to there being so much openly licensed material that you're swimming in it. It feels like. Yeah, I've spent the last year and a half kind of focused on this intersection of open ed and generative AI. That's where my work and my writing and my development have been. And I don't think we know really, Lydia, where it's going yet. It feels very much like it's 1993 or 1994. Like the internet is just kind of starting to become popular. Of course, it had existed before that, but people were first starting to dial up and connect. Our universities were first starting to get connected. And it seems like it's going to change everything, right? Like there are some of us on this phone call on this Zoom call that can remember when you'd register for a college class, you filled out a paper form and you went and you stood in a line and you waited till you got to the front of the line and handed your card in. And then they told you half those sections were full and you had to go to the back of the line and fill out a different card and wait and come to the front of the line again, right? Now we just go on the internet and register, right? It completely transformed the internet, not only transformed teaching and learning, but all the administrative or many of the administrative functions of the university as well, right? And like I think Kurt was saying, there was a lot of, in the late 90s, there was a lot of doomsday predictions. I remember David Noble in particular writing about, how the internet was the end of education. There would be so much cheating, there'd be so much plagiarism, there'd be so much this and that. Online courses would make it so that universities didn't have to employ instructors anymore. They just have somebody build online courses and they'd fire all the faculty. And it's actually kind of funny. You can go back and read those late 90s doomsday papers and just substitute the word AI in everywhere the word internet was. And it's all exactly the same concerns. It's cheating, it's plagiarism, it's we'll replace teachers with this technology, and it's the end of, faculty power. Or anyway, it feels like we're living all of that over again. And in 93, it didn't matter how smart you were. There was no way that you could really tell 10, 20 years into the future what the internet was going to do to higher ed. And it feels very much the same right now. There's literally billions of different paths, right? It's like Doctor Strange sitting there trying to see all 4, billion futures at the same time. It could go so many ways. And I think it's just such an exciting time to be involved, because it is a time where a little nudge this direction or a little nudge that direction can have a big influence, further down the line. So this is the most excited I've been to be in the field in many years. It just feels like a great time right now. I see Chris is nodding his head too.
Before we go to Chris, billions of possible paths. We were hoping that you nailed down the future in this show. And now you're telling us there's billions of possible paths. That's as far as we're going to get in this episode.
Well, I mean, I can tell you the path that I'm going down, but I'm not here to tell you that it's the path that's going to prevail.
Chris, you want to jump in here?
Well, like Charles Dickens said, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. The season of hope, it's the season of despair. And we find ourselves with many opportunities that AI is creating, and we also find ourselves with many terrible things happening in the world. I wore my tie that celebrates spring because I want to acknowledge the equinox and the fact that we're in the lighter part of the year, at least in the northern hemisphere, and that renewal provides hope. So I want to change themes a little. And David and Lynn, we invited you not just because of your own work, but because the knowledge and the experience that you bring in general. So I want to run a framing by you that I've been thinking about for where we are in history and get your honest, constructive responses about it. So I've been thinking that was then and this is now. So 5 years ago, everyone rightly was very concerned about the pandemic. And we, one of the reasons we began Silver Lining for Learning was to say there is a workaround that's possible for education, that's already here, it's already well studied and established to be effective. The technologies are now available to take it to scale. And the only barriers to this workaround are, first, that many people still believe it to be inferior, despite a huge amount of research establishing that online learning, while it's different than face-to-face learning and has different strengths and weaknesses, can be equally effective. And second, that it's a different way of teaching. And so if you don't know what you're doing, things are going to get worse before they get better. And we're here to try to help you have a different way of teaching. And so at the time, we were kind of a lighthouse that attempted to highlight not just what we knew, but models and projects all across the world that we're using online learning. Yes, to do things better, but also to do better things. So now is now, and now is quite different. It's a different metaphor. This is like the flood in the Bible, I think, or if you are familiar with an animated film that won an Academy Award called Flow. If you haven't seen that, it's a terrific movie. And again, it captures this idea of flood that just carries everything before it. So there's no workaround here. the messaging is basically, we'd better build some arcs. We'd better build some things that can ride the flood and carry us safely until we get beyond it. And that may well involve some use of technology, but it's not this sort of online learning is a complete way of doing it. It's more complicated to build an arc and to figure out what to put in it. But that seems to be where we are, that at the end of the flood, there will be an opportunity to rebuild anew and perhaps different and hopefully better. There will be an opportunity for transformation that we haven't seen for a long time on the wreckage that's being created of the historic infrastructure and models and methods of higher education and education in general. But we got to get through to that time when the floodwaters are receding. And so as I think about the future of Silver Lining for Learning and what our mission might be for the next year or two, it may well be to look at different kinds of arcs or ships that can be created that will be little havens or safe harbors of different kinds that may arise, or mountaintops that we can get on top of, because it's in many ways more scary than the pandemic in terms of the long range consequences. So I'm happy to hear if you think this is all nonsense. It might make me sleep a little better at night, but this is a framing that I think we need to start discussing in education, at least in the kind of education that we try to do on Silver Lining for Learning. So anybody, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this.
Yeah, well, let me share two thoughts. The first is, I think the reason that people, I'm just going to paint with very broad strokes, and so I apologize to the people, to whom this doesn't apply. But I think the overwhelming majority of college instructors, at least, let's just stick with higher ed for a minute, received no training whatsoever in effective instruction, in the science of human learning. Literally everything they know about teaching, they learned by being taught, right? They learned by example. And so when we give them their PhD in economics or literature or music, whatever it is, we send them out into the world, they just go do what they've seen done before in the classroom, right? So when the pandemic comes along and everyone is forced to switch and begin teaching online, they've never seen online teaching before, and they've never had any training. So they literally have no idea what to do, right? So they just feel lost. And I think sometimes in our circles, we talk about how instructors never get training and never have a single class on these things in most of their PhD programs. But I think it's so easy to forget that most teachers standing at the front of the classroom at the higher ed level are just doing what they've seen done. And so if you're an instructor of a certain age and you never took an online course and now you're forced to teach online, you literally have no frame of reference, right? So that makes that terrifying. Something that has been interesting to me for a long time, and this goes back into the 2000s when I was doing kind of more experimenting, is that for very sensible reasons, our first moves into online learning were to take pedagogical models, or let's say practices, that worked in the classroom and try to find out how to make them effective in the online space. Right. So all the way that we teach online typically is always kind of a foreigner, a wanderer in a strange land. If we're going to keep using Bible analogies today, there are these transplants. And just to take one example of a really important different affordance of online versus face-to-face, in a face-to-face class, there's an old joke that once you get past 40 or 50 people in a class, everyone after the second row is distance learning, right? Many of our pedagogies assume or are optimized for a small group, face-to-face discussion, active learning, things like that. And in fact, as you increase the number of students in the class, it starts to break down, right? You can't remember every student's name anymore. You can't remember details about it. You can't connect with them in the same way. A lot of the things that you would do in a classroom, as it scales up, just break. And it scales up really easily online, right? So things start to break pretty easily online. But it turns out that you can go and look in places, and where I first saw this was in massively multiplayer games, and you all will be familiar with Kurt Squire's work and Constance Steinkuhler's work on guilds and kind of informal learning and instruction and mentoring in those spaces. It turns out that there are approaches to teaching and learning that are native to the digital environment. They're kind of indigenous, right? And those methods actually depend on there being hundreds or thousands of people in the guild for them to actually work successfully. And if you were to try to extract them and use them in a face-to-face class, they would also break because they depend on there being a certain amount of scale for them to work. And so this idea that, in the beginning, of course, like you talk about cars as horseless carriages, right? You're looking at the past, trying to find language to talk about the future. So we try to take face-to-face pedagogical practices and implement them online. Of course, that's what we would do initially. But at some point, there are online communities where we can go and look and see if teaching and learning were to develop spontaneously in this environment with these affordances, what would it look like? What shapes and contours would it have? And then we can start teaching our online courses more like that. So I think there's something very similar that's now going to happen with AI, right? We don't know enough yet to talk about it in any way other than a horseless carriage kind of metaphor. And it's really, we're all just struggling to some degree with just a lack of imagination. And there's so many possibilities. There's so much we could do. We're all so accustomed or habituated to doing things either in the classroom or in some kind of traditional online sense that it's hard to wrap your mind around it. And so I think after a lot of rambling on there, I think I agree with a lot of what you're saying, Chris. I just wonder if this flood really is a biblical flood, that after 40 days the waters recede and there is some wreckage to build on top of, or if this is more like a 2-foot, 3-foot rise in ocean level that doesn't go back down, at least not any time in our lifetime, right? It's kind of hard to imagine this rush of AI coming in and then it washing out again. But maybe you don't mean it washing out. Maybe you mean like as we all acclimate to it, that then there's some opportunity for stability. But I think that's the only place where I would say, is the flood the right metaphor? Because does it ever really recede, or is it just another layer? We had the personal computer, and then we had build the internet on top of that, and now we build generative AI on top of it. Is it just another layer in some climb that there never is that pulling away and the mountain peak that comes out, and I can send the dove to get its olive branch and feel good, about my future prospects?
So David, I think you're referring to our article that we wrote, Reflections on the Waves of Emerging Learning Technologies. I'll recommend that article to all our readers. Published a few years ago in ETR&D. Thanks to Lin for publishing that article. Thank you, Lin. Lin, do you want to jump in and add to what David has said?
Well, I'd love actually to hear from you, Kurt, and Lydia, since you've been doing this for 5 years, talking with so many people globally, focusing on the future of learning. So yeah, love to hear from you. And I do have a few comments, but love to hear from you and Lydia.
I have a quick comment before we go to Lydia and then back to you, Lynn. Just that I've been teaching emerging learning technologies for 35 years now. And for a while, it evolved. It evolved and it grew. And my students started calling it the monster syllabus. It became 100 pages long. And so that was a way in which I would keep track of what's happening out there. I just kept adding to the monster. Updating the syllabus every year was it really gave me a migraine headache. I'd put ice cubes on my head. I'd go in the dark room to avoid the spots in front of my eyes. I mean, it was an annual event, updating. Well, a few years ago, I didn't teach that course for 2 years, and I nixed the monster. I killed the monster. There's no way I could update it. So going back to Chris, there's just a flood over my head. I was swimming in all this. I mean, we're covering online learning, mobile learning, e-learning, MOOCs, and our list goes on and on and on. Digital textbooks and so forth. And no one can keep track of all those things. I mean, it's impossible, right? So what I ended up doing to make sense of it, and now I have created frameworks, and many of you recognize my Read, Reflect, Display, and Do framework, R2D2, my Tech Variety framework for motivation. But what I did for this course is I just said, okay, there's all these special journal issues coming at us. I mean, a ton of them, especially in AI now. So I just made every week a special journal issue. And that was a way for me to simplify the course updates, yet to address the current issues in the field. And then I could bring in people who wrote articles or who were the editors of that special issue into the class to talk about why they did this special. In fact, Lynn was the first guest this semester talking to my students. So, that's the one way in which I dealt with this, the mounds of information and data coming at us, and to try and help my students make sense of it. That's one short story anyhow. Lydia?
Yeah, I think for this, I haven't been on Silver Lining for Learning as a host for 5 years, but I have indeed been a listener. And in the past episode, when the host came together to reflect on the 5 years, I think we all agreed on this idea of pockets of innovation around the world, that the innovation often happen highly contextualized, ground up by people who are very familiar with their context and the needs of their local environment. And they come up with this creative idea to make the most of the situation and that they are in. So I guess that's something we reflected on. And I also had an idea about reflection on Chris, your this analogy of the flood, and then you're always really intuitive in coming up with these really helpful analogies. I definitely felt like, Chris, when we were first writing that article around generative AI, like to help teacher navigate the space, I felt there was this flood of like a pressure to feel like the teacher had to reinvent everything they do in the classroom now with generative AI. Like everything, we have to think about how are we going to use AI in the classroom, how it's going to teach the students, what's the role of the teacher. But actually, when we were writing that article, Chris, I don't know if you agree, is that we found a lot of the stuff that teachers do in the classroom is very good, and then we should do more of that. And then perhaps AI can alleviate some of more, I don't know, mundane or administrative tasks, and that can be offload to AI, so teacher can do more of that human to human and like more process-oriented learning with kids. And so I guess the flood, I was thinking about like not let the AI flood to wash away all the good educational practice we know, but to make sure that we amplify those in the age of AI.
Back to you, Lynn.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I love what you said about the pockets of innovations in specific context. And there are so many, right? So that's I really love that. And so going back to what David has been doing with the open resources. So I've just been thinking, there are all these pockets of innovation. They are somewhere, and they are somewhat, some are open. And how do we somehow learn from those pockets of, I think what you're doing here, with Silver Lining for Learning, this is amazing. It's all there, online, open. And Kurt, what you're doing with your class, special issues, those are all like pockets, pockets of sort of synthesized information, knowledge, and pockets of innovation, and how we might be able to somehow make the connections, connect those dots, and then they become more quality, resources, learning resources that can be open for all. So that's something I was thinking just listening to you. And another thing I always thought, watching how young people do things, like going back to, because I've been so involved in the robotics, my son's robotics activities. And I watch them, they work in teams, right? They do all different things. They build robots, they do software, they market, they, speak, present in limited time, and they put flyers together and they learn how to present themselves. And sometimes they actually are pretty good at faking because it's a teamwork and they all have to be able to present a teamwork. Although they are not necessarily doing the work, they say, we did it. Sometimes I wonder how much they actually really know what they did. But the spirit of collaborative work, projects together, and learning without any constraints. They use all kinds of technologies, AI technologies to accomplish what they need. And to me, that's, it is almost like you cannot really say they are doing it online or face to face, right? They are all blurring. They are all just, sometimes they're together, they don't talk, they're online. Sometimes they're online, but they are really collaborating, right? So there's the blurry of the boundary there. And I also love what you said, Chris, about the flow. Actually, I just watched the movie the day before, yesterday. And so sometimes think about the difference between human and machines, right? The instinct of survival, right? That instinct of survival, which probably does not happen for machines. I don't know. Maybe that boundary is blurry too. But when you have the instinct of survival, then you run into different people or species, and then you work together to survive. And then I also love what you said about something new built on the wreckage, right? The flood, and so so it's all interesting. I'll leave it there.
There is a Chinese curse that says, may you live in interesting times. And we definitely have that at our disposal. I think that it is amazing how many important things we're not taught in academic education. David, you made a good point about that. I remember telling my students that I held an endowed chair at Harvard in a field in which I'd had one course in my life. That course was in 1968. It was on punch cards. And from that course, I concluded that there was no future in computers at all. And it wasn't until the Apple I in 1975 that I saw the sea change. And everything that I've learned about the field that I was teaching, I learned on my own. And that's increasingly the case, I think, in the level of change and the level of disruption that we see in society. So in addition to taking a course in understanding teaching and learning, which is certainly missing for people outside of ed schools who graduate, I think every faculty member should take a course in promoting change and scale, because believing that faculty are change agents, they're not simply, following orders, and believing that all of the models that we highlight on Silver Lining for Learning could be scaled. and feeling that one has the skills to do that if you find the model attractive. Those are both things that would be really good to have as part of our standard preparation. Kurt, you said you had one more reflection-related question.
Yeah, I have a final wrap-up question. David has a comment before I go to that. David.
Oh, very briefly, I just thinking more about the flood metaphor and Chris talking about our need to build arcs. It just made me think, it wasn't an option for Noah, but I think there are more options available to us too. Like in addition to thinking about arcs, if we know that this huge flood is coming, could we also think about what kind of new hydroelectric infrastructure we could build, right? Like if this huge push is coming, in addition to thinking about how we survive it, also some thinking about how we use it, to accomplish goals that we want to accomplish. Obviously we can't accomplish any goals if we don't survive. But I think in addition to the arc, what kind of turbines or something could we build that would leverage this flood to generate power and create additional goodness? So yes, if we've got a flood of lemons coming, how do we stockpile sugar and cups and something like that. Anyway.
Well, I want to go to a final question. I have 5 minutes left. And I want Lynn and her answer to the question to start off just telling us a little bit about your NSF position and, sending a signal out to young people out there and how they might contact you and get involved in writing NSF grants and all that. But as a precursor to answering this question, anyhow, I'm wondering what both of you think that we might or should pursue in the coming year for the season 6. What areas should we be exploring and who should we be contacting to appear on this show? And if you can't think of anything, an alternative question is, what's one thing that you've read or seen or heard about recently that you want to talk about and excite other people to go and read or find or visit at a conference? What's the one thing? And maybe that's the same question asked in 2 different ways. But we'll start with Lynn because I want to hear just a minute about your NSF position and then try and answer that question. And David, we'll have 2 minutes for you. Lynn.
Well, you could say it's the worst timing or best timing. I'm right in the, with a lot of every day there are changes, but it's very exciting. Being at NSF definitely has given me another whole a level of appreciation for NSF program officers and the people who work there. So about my, I guess about my role, it's very similar to editor. I look at the proposals that are submitted and conduct peer review panels and make recommendations for awards and also manage the existing awards and also help think about priorities, think about innovations in the field. So what we're doing here definitely helps inform me what are the important issues in the field that I can recommend to NSF. So those are the things that as program officer that I do at NSF. What I think it's only been 2 months, but the experience has made me really think a lot about policies or politics. Somehow before, I was always, of course, in academics. I don't know whether, it's aloof or what. So I just never paid much attention to policies or politics. I just was so focused on, what the field was interested, what I was interested, but without making the connection to policies, I think the impact of work is just much less. So I'll stop there.
And now what about your one thing, Lynn, or one resource or recommendation?
Well, I've been looking at George Siemens, following his newsletter all the time, and Peter Dementis, his newsletter, blogs. So, paying attention to what's happening with some people. But for me, I think really looking at what's going on in the world, in terms of policy, it is important for our field. The funding, the policies, what's going on with the future of academics. They all, again, we're at a very interesting age.
We talked about having a show about policy. I've approached some people. There's a little hesitancy out there because of the political times that we're in, but we're going to pursue that. That's a great point. Thanks for bringing it back, Lynn, because that maybe I'll have multiple shows on it, in fact. David.
Realizing that it's Saturday morning, but the resource that sticks out in my head is a paper I read this morning. I think maybe was released yesterday by Ethan Mollick and some of his collaborators, a pre-registered randomized controlled trial, over 750 people from Procter & Gamble, looking at the impact of working as an individual versus working as a team versus working as an individual with AI versus working as a team with AI. And I won't spoil the ending for you, but terrific design, tons of collaborators, really amazing paper that it seems like every week there's another paper that's just really amazing. So it's hard to pick one. By the time somebody listens to this podcast in a week or two, they're gonna be like, man, that paper is ancient. That's like 15 days old now because things are just moving so fast. So Ethan obviously is a really great follow if you're not following him. I think the other person I would say is Andrej Karpathy, who quit his job as, I think he was chief scientist at OpenAI, and is now just making YouTube content and other content, helping people learn how to create from scratch large language models and helping people understand their inner workings and what's really happening there. So maybe the plug I would say, although I think George would be a fabulous guest, the work that he's doing right now, trying to reinvent education with generative AI and knowledge graphs and some things like that is just super interesting. But I think it is the longer you wait to try to look under the hood and figure out what's going on with these models and how they work, just the further behind you're going to be. So I would just encourage people, like if you haven't been to Hugging Face yet, there's a huge open source software ecosystem around large language models. There's open weights models, there's open software. It's very, very straightforward and again, free to start playing around and start getting involved and tinkering in a way that'll allow you to understand how the tools work and what they're really capable of in a way that you can't if you're just kind of a casual user. So if you listen to this podcast, you're probably in educational technology, learning technology, something like that. I'd say don't skimp on digging down one level of technical detail and learning more about what's going on with fine tune a model to see how that process works, run models locally. So I think that would be the kind of resources I would encourage people to go and look at.
So the OpenAI resource or person sounds interesting and intriguing. Please send me the name because I couldn't spell that, and I'll look him up and we'll invite him and others that you both have mentioned.
Yeah.
I want to definitely send out hugs to both of you for being here. And if I see you in person, either at AERA or ACT, I'll give you a personal hug. This is our 5-year anniversary special show. So, this only happens once every 5 years. We can have such a thing. And it's been great. And thanks for appearing on limited, not short notice, but we didn't give you a real advanced notice for this show. And I'm sure Lydia and Chris will agree that this is one of the best shows that we've had. And it's great to have you both on this episode. I need to introduce the next show, however, and that is going to be next week. Hopefully, Punya's working on Punya Mishra, one of our co-hosts, is working on this, meeting with Miri Schoenfeld from Israel, who will talk about technology for intercultural education in Israel and beyond, with a couple of her colleagues as well on that show. So that will be on March 29th. And it'll be recorded and put up shortly after that, maybe on March 30th. So come back to season 5 for Silver Lining for Learning. See you all next time.